totally different topic. The talk of the golf world is this book excerpt that came out about Phil Mickelson. I'm curious what your reaction, what the reaction in there was when you read about it.
I mean, at least he can bet on the Ryder Cup this year because he won't be a part of it, so.
Just as things seem to be starting to melt down at the PGA Tour headquarters with Jay Monahan coming back because he was suffering from anxiety, aka he was stressed out. And longtime PGA Tour employee Andy Pazder has just resigned after 30 years of being with the PGA Tour.
Some breaking news today. Andy Pazder, who is the Chief Tournaments and Competitions Officer for the PGA Tour, is resigning.
So something's rotten in Denmark, even more rotten than we previously thought. Now, we've got obviously the other side, the PGA Tour side, throwing a little bit of shade.
I know what he's talking about.
Sometimes you know and sometimes you don't.
Here's what I've got to say on this. Easy there, Phil Mickelson.
At Phil Mickelson via Billy Walters. Billy Walters is known as one of the biggest and best gamblers in American history, and as often happens, he ended up in jail. So when you look at the book he's putting out about Phil Mickelson's gambling habits, we've got to take it with a grain of salt. I'm going to take us through an article from 2018, that's 5 years ago, if you do the math correctly, and you should if you're into gambling. And I think this article basically illuminates why Billy Walters really wants to get back at Phil Mickelson. The title of this article is Billy Walters on his conviction, gambling, and ex-friend Lefty. Lefty, of course, is Phil Mickelson. William Billy T. Walters, 71 at that time, now at 5 years, who in his prime had the financial muscle and acumen to move betting lines worldwide and scared Las Vegas sportsbooks and offshore gambling operators to the degree that they refused to take his bets, is laying low inside the Pensacola Federal Prison Camp, a minimum security facility housed on a naval air station in the Florida Panhandle. The biggest threat in these minimum security prisons in Florida would be the hurricanes, which strike every 16 months or so. These are no Alcatraz type prisons where you're going to have a guy like Clint Eastwood have to get into the water and swim to safety and actually, in the end, never be found, presumably eaten by sharks. I love prison shows. I love Shawshank Redemption. I love YouTube prison shows. There's that one dude who's all roided out, who's screaming at you motivational things the whole time.
The common denominator of successful people is their ability to do as many things a day possible to get where they want to go.
There's Lockdown 24-1. Lockdown 24-1, and also, I guess, to some extent, the motivational guy. What's fascinating is how much of their wisdom and input in relation to the prison system actually applies outside the prison system. I'm going to let you think about that and let that simmer a little bit. Because once you see the parallels between prison life and being outside prison. Anyway, Walters is up at dawn and goes about his day in a Christmas green prison-issued uniform. The sugar white beaches gather waves just 15 miles away, but they're out of sight and mind. So too is Walters' pampered life of private jets, designer homes in places such as Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, and rounds of golf at plush courses. His business life outside of sports gambling, playing the stock market, and that's key, and managing his car dealerships and commercial real estate ventures also has been neutered. So Billy Walters waits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in Manhattan to hear an appeal this spring of his conviction in the insider trading case that sent him to federal prison for 5 years. My whole passion, my whole life is nothing but gambling, Walters said in an October interview in his Las Vegas golf club just ahead of his reporting to prison. That is what I wanted to do. I probably came in as a gambler and I'm going out as a gambler. So you can see here that another person who has reputation as a big gambler is Phil Mickelson. Inevitably, these two met up at some point and became friends. As per the excerpt that's shown in Golf Digest titled Phil Mickelson's Gambling Losses Totaled Nearly $100 Million, former associate alleges in new book by Billy Walters. Billy Walters says he first met Phil Mickelson in 2006 at the AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am in Northern California. In May 2008, Billy was invited to play another Pro-Am at the Wachovia Championship in Charlotte, North Carolina as a guest of the bank, and there he bumped into Phil in the locker room, and at this point, Phil said to him, "I hear you do partnerships," and then Billy said, "I do, but only if someone has access to places I can't bet, or places where they can bet more money than me." Phil had both. Here's the crux of the matter. Before he entered federal prison, Walters spoke at length with Outside the Lines, eager to discuss the insider trading conviction and his life-changing trial. He lamented not testifying in his own defense. Oftentimes you're told not to testify in your own defense. He groused about how his one-time friend and gambling partner, golfer Phil Mickelson, left him high and dry and might be most responsible for him being in prison. High and Dry is a pretty solid Radiohead song. And he spoke about finding perspective in recent years and how he had prepared to contend with the loss of luxury, freedom, and adrenaline-inducing challenges that defined him for decades. Here's a look at Billy Walters 5 years ago. That's the Bali High logo. I have a shirt with it on it too. And that's Billy looking pensive, maybe even wistful. The minimum security camp Walters lives in is deemed one of the easiest places to serve a federal sentence. Most inmates are white-collar criminals in for less than 10 years. It is confinement though. Visitors only on weekends. Lights out by 9:30 p.m. Lunch as simple as 2 hot dogs, coleslaw, and a bag of chips. In other words, this is basically my normal life. I typically only see people on the weekends because I'm so busy building out YouTube's hottest golf channel, which is obviously Big Boy Pants Golf. I see a lot of my friends on the weekends where I'll bring out a lawn chair for both of us, multiple chairs, and we'll watch our dogs play in the park. Lights out by 9:30 p.m. Lights out for me by 9:15 p.m. Very tired. Lunch as simple as 2 hot dogs, coleslaw, and a bag of chips. I'm at 1 hot dog and a fountain soda from Costco. So actually, if anything, I'm living a lifestyle that's worse than a minimum security prison. Now you had this former NBA referee, Tim Donaghy, spent 11 months inside the Pensacola facility a decade ago after pleading guilty to participating in a gambling scandal conspiracy. He remembers the prison attire, the dozen inmates crammed into a room with 6 sets of bunk beds, afternoons in the weight room, and evenings in the library, damp winter days and nights without heat, filling up on cans of tuna purchased from the commissary. I mean, a certain portion of that, where it was damp winter nights and nights without heat, it's either a song or part of a romance movie. Once you get into a routine, it's very relaxed, Donaghy said. As long as you keep to yourself, you should not have too many problems. Folks, if any of you has the unfortunate experience of ending up in prison, with my knowledge from what I've watched on these YouTube channels and movies and you know, you just get that vibe out there. Never get into debt with anyone in prison, because to pay off that debt will be a fundamentally life-changing experience and you will be forever disturbed by it. So here you've got Walters. He grew up poor in the hills of Munfordville, a rural Kentucky outpost between Louisville and Nashville. His father was a gambler and died before Walters' first birthday. His mother was a hard drinker who walked out on her son and 2 daughters. Young Billy was raised in a house with no running water or indoor plumbing by his grandmother, who died when he was 13. He was married at 17 and became a father at 18. He was $200K in debt not long after moving to Las Vegas in the early 1980s. So that's probably like 600 grand back then. But few people have out-hustled the fearless multimillionaire, one equally comfortable chatting up the hired help as he is boardroom tycoons. Folks, he's a man of the people. At least he was back then. Here's another key part of this article. The biggest challenge I will have in there, I have a very active mind. Sometimes I wish I could turn it off. I can't. The challenge I'll have in there is me making sure I am involved in something that is going to keep me mentally active and something I am going to be interested in. And what other better thing to keep your mind active than to write a book that goes after the man you blame for not helping you not be in prison? And obviously 5 years later, we have this book come out, and it's talking about Phil Mickelson, a man that Billy Walters, again, believes is the reason that Billy Walters had to serve prison time. Insider trading. You get a little tip from a buddy, you use it, oops, that's insider trading, now you're going to jail. So here we have part of Walters' plan is also to avenge his insider trading conviction. This is why this dude spent time in the slammer. Nearly a year ago, on April 7th, a jury convicted Walters of 10 counts of conspiracy, securities fraud, and wire fraud. Prosecutors said Walters illegally made $40 million by trading Dean Food Co. stock from 2008 to 2015. Thomas Davis, former Dean Foods board chairman, testified that he told Walters about major Dean Foods developments before they became known publicly. I just lost the biggest bet of my life, Walters said minutes after the jury had returned its verdict. To say I was surprised would be the biggest understatement of my life. Frankly, I'm in total shock. And here we go. The case dragged in Phil Mickelson too. Prosecutors said Mickelson made nearly $1 million after Walters told him in 2012 to buy Dean Food stock. Mickelson gave the profits to Walters to cover gambling debts he had owed him, prosecutors said. Though Mickelson never faced charges in the case, the Securities and Exchange Commission sued him over the stock trades, and Mickelson agreed to repay the money. So Walters recites a litany of reasons why he believes his conviction was unfair, from alleged FBI corruption to a slanted case against him to make up for all the other times over decades prosecutors had tried but failed to catch him doing something illegal. Apparently this fishing expedition ended up catching Billy Walters. But Walters also blames his former good friend and gambling partner, Lefty. During the investigation, Mickelson twice told FBI agents he had no knowledge of insider trading involving Walters.
I don't know anything.
What were you doing inside?
Just drinking coffee?
Not gambling?
No, I don't. This is a coffee shop. There's no gambling. I don't know anything.
That's a good thing for Billy Walters. But when it came to show up in court, Mickelson stayed away. Mickelson's longtime attorney, Glenn Cohen, declined comment when reached by Outside the Lines. Court filings show that Mickelson's attorneys had said if he were to be called to testify in Walters' trial, he would exercise his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, which is probably always the smart play. Walters' camp, however, said prosecutors never attempted to compel Mickelson to testify to get at the truth, something they could have done by offering him immunity from prosecution. But if what Billy Walters was saying before was true, that these guys were constantly trying to find something on him, they're not going to offer him anything. I mean, their total focus is trying to be like, how can we grab this guy, nab this guy, and throw him in the slammer? Unfortunately, now it seems that Billy Walters is now focused on having to find a bad guy in his mind to blame this nightmare of a situation on. Here's a guy that all he had to do was come forward and tell the truth, Walters said in October, as he leaned forward in a chair behind his nearly 10-foot wide office desk. It's marble top home to 3 computer monitors. That was all he had to do. The guy wouldn't do that because he was concerned about his image. He was concerned about his endorsements. I don't know if we can believe that anymore, because obviously Phil Mickelson knew his image and his endorsements would take a hit when he joined Live Golf. And again, his endorsements, at least for a time period, did dip, and he had to answer a lot of tough questions, including questions about the 9/11 families, which now are obviously being pushed toward the PGA Tour side. I believe that Phil Mickelson followed his attorney's advice, which was the sound advice, is you don't want to get involved in this. Plead the fifth if you have to. Billy Walters continues, and this kind of inner rage is going to work itself out via a book, which he did write. My God, in the meantime, a man's life is on the line. He's going to go to prison, and you get prosecutors up there during the entire trial, the entire month. All they talked about over and over was me giving my friends insider information. That is all they talked about. And they knew that jurors were all up on the internet reading that stuff about Phil profiting from the Dean Foods stock purchase. So Phil potentially could have profited off this Dean Foods stock purchase, and it appears he did as you go into the article. But he's getting this information from Billy Walters, who's getting it from an inside source, hence the the term insider trading. Mickelson still starred in the courtroom, even if he wasn't there in person. He was mentioned by name at least 122 times during the 3-week trial, the majority of mentions from prosecuting attorneys. Both Walters' team and prosecutors agree that in the summer of 2012, at the height of the insider trading, the professional golfer owed a sports gambling debt to Walters of $1.95 million. Also stipulated was that Mickelson had accrued and repaid similar gambling debts in the past to Walters. And this is actually tying in well with the book that Billy Walters put out that's having all these transactions. I'm sure the government at that time and all the prosecutors have reviewed these files, so it does appear that Phil Mickelson probably did make a crazy, ridiculous amount of gambling bets, both wins and losses.
Basically, Phil bet about $1 billion worth in 5 years.
Yes, sports betting is legal. And here's the PGA Tour telling you how to bet on golf. This even has the game types and terminology 101, just so you can become more proficient at betting on golf. And last time I checked, if something wasn't illegal, then an American can spend his or her money any way they please. The government argued that Mickelson's text and phone communication with Walters in July 2012 was tied to Dean Foods information Walters had been hearing from Davis, the former board chairman. On July 30th, Mickelson purchased 3,900 shares of Dean Foods in an account under his and his wife's name. He purchased another 240 shares in trust accounts for his then minor children. A day later, Mickelson invested $2.4 million in an additional 196,100 shares. That's a lot of shares. Federal investigators found the trades were Mickelson's first Dean Foods stock purchases, though it was revealed that as early as 2008, Walters himself held 4 million shares of Dean Foods stock. So, Billy, you already had tons of the stock. I don't know why you're so focused on Phil Mickelson. Maybe you're thinking he could have helped you out more than he could have, but you kind of made your own bet at this point. Walters said he researched and knew the inner workings of the company as well as anyone, and by the summer of 2012, the stock was vastly undervalued and a free roll, gambler's parlance, for a wager with limited downside and a huge upside. After a positive second quarter report and news in early August of a possible spinoff, the value of Dean Foods, the nation's largest milk processor, spiked almost 40%, $12.42 a share to $17.46 a share. Federal investigators found Mickelson cashed a profit of $930,000 the next day when he sold all his shares and those of his children. In this instance, Walters held off selling his shares for nearly a year, but the government claimed that over the course of the nearly 7-year insider trading plot, he netted more than $43 million, both from purchasing stock but also by avoiding losses by selling Dean Foods shares after receiving helpful insight from Davis. Interesting, because it does seem like members of the government, the Congress, do make a lot of money in the stock market. But let's not go there. That's a story for another time. Mickelson just made under $1 million, money that ultimately he transferred right back to the defendant because of gambling debt. Prosecutors told the jury, of course, Phil Mickelson could pay it back, but this was another way for Billy Walters to feed himself by giving Mickelson this sure thing, information that he knew was going to happen. He knew that the money would come back around, and that's exactly what it did. Walters' attorney kind of points out the obvious here, that if you're Billy Walters and you believe that someone has given you illegal inside information, the last thing you would do is give it to Phil Mickelson, one of the most famous athletes in the world. That is immediately going to track regulatory scrutiny and lead back to Bill Walters. I can see that point too, but also I don't have the gambler's mindset. I don't know the inner workings, so it's a toss-up as to that. During the trial, prosecutors showed that Mickelson transferred nearly $2 million to cover his sports gambling debt to Walters on September 19th, 2012, a month after his big stock win in Dean Foods. Mickelson was spared criminal charges and embarrassing court appearance, though the Securities and Exchange Commission later identified him as a relief defendant in a civil complaint and required repayment of $930,000 in trading profits and $105,000 in interest. 2012 is significant because apparently, according to Billy Walters, Phil Mickelson tried to have Billy Walters place a $400,000 bet on the U.S. Ryder Cup team during that Ryder Cup, and fortunately it wasn't placed because the U.S. team actually lost. Mickelson's gambling past has been well documented, including by Billy Walters, apparently. For example, in 2016, Outside the Line reported Mickelson's connection to an illegal offshore gambling operation. Federal court filings revealed an intermediary had acted as a conduit to pay a $2.7 million gambling debt Mickelson owed an offshore sportsbook. Gregory Silvera, a California-based agent for the offshore site, subsequently pleaded guilty to money laundering charges and remains incarcerated at a federal prison camp in Arizona. Mickelson was not criminally charged, though the government kept the nearly $3 million that was being transferred to allegedly pay off the gambling debt. Here's where I'm confused. So Seth Waugh of the PGA of America and Martin Slumbers, head of the R&A, both were at Deutsche Bank during the period of time where a lot of questionable financial activity was going on, and for which Deutsche Bank was subsequently fined billions by the DOJ. No jail time there. Here, jail time. Folks, grab a cool glass of water before I read the next line. In Walters' mind, Mickelson held the key to his freedom if he had just explained to jurors what had really happened. What could Phil Mickelson have done here? He's going to say, well, Billy Walters recommended that I buy this Dean Foods Co. stock, so I bought it. And you think that that's going to be exculpatory? I don't know what Billy Walters expected, but he's had a lot of time in prison, during which time his daughter committed suicide, and he states that he still believes he could have saved her had he not been in prison. And he's obviously fixated on Lefty and not on his own actions. Remember, when you point your finger at someone else, you've got 3 fingers pointing back at you. It was clear from the pleadings, the public documents during the trial, Mickelson was interviewed on more than one occasion by FBI agents, said Richard Wright, Walters' longtime personal attorney. And he denied any wrongdoing on his behalf as well as Bill's behalf, essentially denying he got any tips. He had denied that to the government. Billy Walters, Phil said you did nothing wrong. There's nothing more he could do there. If he had testified, he would have denied he had any insider information from Bill Walters. In my judgment, it would have helped us. I can't say, oh, that means we absolutely win or anything, but it would have made someone else's credibility an issue, and it just adds up. From a legal perspective, Wright understands Mickelson being a courtroom no-show. Obviously, if you look at it selfishly like any lawyer, if I can keep my client off the stand, that is the safest, most conservative approach that anyone can take, Wright said. So, maybe Phil could have testified on Billy Walters' behalf, but even as Billy Walters' lawyer points out, doesn't necessarily mean it would have made any difference. And I believe if the situation were reversed, Billy Walters' attorney would have told Billy Walters not to take the stand on behalf of his then friend, Lefty. So the guy who actually gave Billy Walters the insider information, last name of Davis initially told investigators that he and Walters did nothing wrong, but after cutting a deal for a reduced prison sentence, Davis told a different story in court. He told of having provided Walters non-public information about Dean Foods over a lengthy period of time. He told of passing along such information as earnings projections, operating plans, and specific company transactions. He told of being indebted to Walters for nearly $1 million in 2 loans. As he became more indebted, Davis added, Walters became more demanding of information. Billy Walters, you should have written a book about this guy, not about Phil Mickelson. As part of his deal with the government, Davis pleaded guilty to 12 criminal counts, including securities and wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and perjury. With Davis facing at least 10 years under federal sentencing guidelines, prosecutors recommended he not be imprisoned due to his cooperation, but the presiding judge sentenced the government's star witness to 2 years in prison, labeling Davis a phony, fraud, and a crook. Davis, who at one time enjoyed minority ownership in both the Texas Rangers and Dallas Stars, is serving time at a federal prison camp in Texas. Billy Walters, you need to channel that anger towards this guy. He sold you down the river, not Phil Mickelson. Billy Walters does seem to have gotten the short end of the stick here, because if you read this paragraph, it was Walters' attorneys who raised the specter of the government leaking grand jury materials to the media, alleging the leaks were orchestrated to bring exposure to a case going nowhere. Details from the illegal leaks were published the year before Walters' grand jury indictment and included specifics on trades being examined and records being analyzed, the identity of those approached by the FBI, as well as supposed targets of investigation. Total fishing expedition. and they're trying to build the case. This is another, obviously, as the article even says, a black eye suffered by the FBI and Justice Department. Former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, initially denied the leaks ever took place, dismissing the allegations to the judge as baseless. He described defense efforts to unmask the leaker as a fishing expedition. Soon after, in December 2016, Bharara acknowledged the leaks as an incontrovertible fact and identified the sources David Chavez, an FBI white-collar crime specialist and supervising investigator on the Walters insider trading case. So obviously here we also have a little bit of questionable government activity, which nowadays is basically to be expected. I found this quote to be particularly on point by Billy Walters. Everybody in this country bets on sports. If you were to take away the office pools, fantasy pools, people betting on sports, I guarantee the TV viewership will be cut in less than half. Folks, how many of us out there watch sports just to throw a few bucks down on it? And without the act of actually throwing a couple bucks on it, you wouldn't watch the sports. The gambling sphere and the sports sphere are forever intertwined. Moving forward, I hope that Billy Walters finds peace and that he realizes that Phil Mickelson wasn't actually the one who did him dirty. It's the other people like Davis, the guy who's actually giving him the tips, and if you read this article in its entirety, the government, the justice system, when they want to get you, they obviously play by a different set of rules where, to me, when I'm reading this, maybe they should have called it even and Billy Walters should not have served jail time. But then again, remember, Martha Stewart also served jail time for insider trading. So if anyone out there is on a golf course with a buddy and you ask him about his company and then you maybe throw some money on the stock of his company, it's such a gray area. This is Big Boy Pants Golf, hoping none of you serve any time in the slammer.